Hello and welcome to the module on how to write thesis statements. In writing college papers and other things, coming up with a clear purpose statement or thesis statement is frequently the most difficult things we have to do as writers. So I'm hoping that this video will help you figure out an approach that will make it easier for you to create a thesis statement for your papers. So let's start with looking at a definition of what a thesis statement is. So a thesis statement is basically a statement, but more specifically a theory or a claim that is presented as a premise or argument that will then in that paper have to be maintained or proved. So that's important. It has to be an assertive statement. It cannot be a question. Now, a thesis statement should or could be the answer to a question, okay, and that could be the prompt that your professor is giving you to answer. It could be a question you're asking yourself as you're developing a topic for a paper. But a paper should always start with a question, and the thesis statement should be the answer to that question, on which we then have to elaborate in the paper itself and show a clear analysis of our facts to prove that thesis statement. Okay. So it is essentially the essence of your analysis of all the research that you gathered in writing that paper. Just remember, it cannot in itself be a fact. A fact is an undeniable truth. It doesn't need to be proven, but it needs to be fact-based. So what you want to do in approaching any research paper is to begin with that question. Again, either the question your professor is asking you to answer or a question that you want answered. Please never start a research paper or go into any kind of research situation with a personal opinion you've already formed, because what happens frequently in this situation is rather than approaching our research with an open mind, we're now sort of picking and choosing to find facts that support what we already believe in. Okay? What you want to do once you start gathering facts in your research is to sort of organize them in different themes, ideas that are related, because what that will then help you is to take those individual ideas that will then end up in unified paragraphs within the body of your paper and summarize those supporting ideas into one main argument. Okay, so they all should be related enough to some extent that it makes sense to then synthesize them into one cohesive statement. And that's always a challenge in writing a thesis statement. Okay. So this will give you sort of a draft outline. Once you've completed your paper, go back and make sure that the thesis still makes sense. Sometimes we may have written a perfect paper, but the thesis itself doesn't work anymore. What we then do is make adjustments to the thesis. So please don't ever think that the thesis is something that is written in stone and that it can never ever be changed again. The thesis is a departure point, but as you are conducting more research and work on your paper, the thesis might ultimately change, and that's okay. All right, as you are refining your thesis at the end of that process, begin by asking yourself, does it still answer or respond to the assignment? So if your professor asked you a question, does the paper you have written answer that question? Okay? Is it clear and specific? Okay, so again, it should be ideally a one-sentence statement that needs to be specific and it needs to be clear. Okay, so someone reading your paper for the first time should know by the time he or she reads your thesis statement what this paper is going to be about and what your argument will be. Does it contain one main idea? So we want to make sure that it doesn't go off in all these different directions that may be vaguely related to one another, but in order to create a unified paper, we have to start with one central idea that is unified. Then we need to look again whether it presents an arguable claim. So do we still have to present data and analysis of those data to support that statement? Okay. The last question, does it justify discussion? Essentially, it's related to that. Is can we, do we still need to look at the data? Can there still be a discussion that sort of compares the information in order to support that main statement? All right, here are some examples of some weak and some strong thesis statements, so look at those together. The subject of this essay is the economic impact of global trade. All right, that's a weak example because it doesn't really present an argument. It sort of states in very vague terms that, hey, this is in general terms what I'm going to be writing about. That's not an argument. Okay? So it's the economic impact of what? On whom? On what? So we need to understand what this is about. So the alternative here might be, for example, the low-cost supply of fruits and vegetables from Mexico and Central America prohibits U.S. farmers from selling their organic produce at competitive prices. Okay? So now we're more specific in terms of which economic impact we're talking about and how specifically it impacts a group of people or has some impact on a situation. All right, another weak example. There are many positive and negative aspects to the use of oral contraceptives as a method of birth control. All right, one of my red flag words when I grade my students' writing is the word many. Many frequently is a very vague way of saying, I really don't know. I'm just kind of assuming there are a lot. Okay, so try to avoid the word many as much as possible. Try to replace it with actual numbers, statistics, estimates, whatever it is. Okay, and it's also way too broad. So we're saying, yeah, there are pros and there are cons. We don't know what they are and what it means. Okay, so it's too broad. Now, you could potentially write a compare and contrast essay in which you are comparing those pros and cons. But again, we need to narrow down from the beginning what they're going to be, what it means. Okay, so here an alternative could be that health insurance plans should cover free birth control pills for women because, in addition to preventing unwanted pregnancies, they regulate the menstrual cycle, make periods less painful, and reduce the risk of uterine cancer. Okay, so now we've narrowed down what the specific pros are that support our argument. All right, here is a strong example. The number of persons infected with AIDS on the African continent continues to increase because of the population's lack of education about the sexually transmitted disease and effective methods of prevention. So the reason I think this works really well, aside from being clear and specific and having an arguable claim, it's sort of a cause and effect relationship. So because people on the African continent lack education about AIDS and how it's transmitted and how they can prevent the transmission of that disease, infection rates increase. Conversely, we could say if people on the African continent were better educated about how the disease is transmitted and how it could be prevented, we could decrease the infection rates. Okay, so what we now need to see in the paper are specific, relevant, credible data on here are the infection rates, here is how they've been going up over a period of time, here is what individual countries in Africa are doing to educate their population, and here's why those methods are not working. And maybe looking at what are other countries doing and in doing a much better job at educating their populations about this disease. All right, so we're going to do an exercise. I'm going to give you 6 pairs of thesis statements. So what I want you to do for each of them on that page, pause the video, look at the pair of statements, decide which one does not work and why not. Decide which one works and why that's a much more successful example. Okay. Then move on to the next page, because there I will give you the answer, and then there I would like you to compare the answer I'm giving you to the answer that you came up with, and hopefully those will match. All right, so B is the successful choice. A is simply a fact. We know DC is not a state, so therefore residents of the District of Columbia have to pay taxes without being represented in Congress. Okay? If you look at a DC license plate, it will say taxation without representation. Okay? So nowhere to go with that. That's just a fact. Okay? So B will actually set up that argument. Okay? So here what we need in the paper is we need data from other cities who are in a similar situation, whether it's Mexico City or any other capital city across the world that has a similar status legally and is not part of the country overall. And what kind of media campaigns were conducted there, what kind of pressures for constitutional amendments were affected. Recently, Congress actually passed a solution in favor of statehood for Washington, D.C. So we would probably look at what has transpired there, what was accomplished in Congress, and what has led up to that. So it's an arguable thesis. We just now need the relevant data to back it up. All right, in exercise 2, again, B is the successful choice. A is far too vague. Yes, when a woman kills her child, she's going to need help. One immediate problem is the word obviously. If something is that obvious, we shouldn't need to write a paper to argue a point or to prove it. Okay, if something is obvious, then there's really nowhere to go with that. So that word should really never be part of a thesis. And I'm always nervous about using words like always and never, but in this case, I would not use the word obvious in a thesis statement. All right, now B sets up the argument that postpartum psychosis is a medical and or psychological disorder that can cause new mothers to take actions against their child that they just cannot control and can therefore not be legally held responsible. Okay, so what we need here now is we need data from studies, case studies of mothers where that happened. We need statements, testimony from psychiatrists, psychologists, gynecologists, people who really understand this issue and who can coherently and based on facts argue how this affects new mothers and why new mothers are not responsible for that kind of behavior. All right, in exercise 3A is the successful choice. B is just a historical fact. Yes, Marcus Garvey initiated the popular Back to Africa movement. End of story. There's nowhere to go. Okay. A sets up an argument that will need to be supported, again, with a detailed analysis of the conditions politically and economically in the early 20th century for African Americans in the United States and why that inspired some of them to return to Africa. Okay. So again, we need those data to support that argument, but A sets up an actual argument, whereas B does not. Number four is kind of an interesting example because all it really took was a major pandemic to convince people that online grocery shopping was an effective way to go. But here, A does not work. These online grocery stores were doomed to fail because today's shoppers are too short-sighted. That's clearly more like a personal opinion. That's almost like people were just too stupid to get it. Okay, we're not going to find any data to support that people were too short-sighted. Okay, that's clearly someone's personal opinion without any evidence to back it up. Now, B sets up the argument that online grocery stores didn't have sufficient startup capital. That's always important in starting a business. That they had delivery problems. Maybe they didn't have enough drivers. Maybe it took too long to respond to orders, and that they didn't advertise effectively enough. Again, we can go back and look at actual data from failed online delivery venues and sort of look at how much money did they invest in advertising, what kind of delivery problems did they encounter, okay? And then decide how we can organize those data, those facts, to support that argument. All right, in number 5, B is the successful choice. The problem with A is that it is essentially just the definition of seasonal affective disorder. Yes, that's what it is. End of story. There's nowhere to go with that. Now, B sets up the fact that sometimes light therapy or antidepressants don't help. So for people who are in that situation, there are potentially dietary changes and dietary supplements. Okay? So here we need data, studies, maybe universities, other places in countries in Scandinavia, in Iceland, Greenland, potentially Alaska, where we have seasonal affective disorder, to see what studies have been done for alternatives that can help people who struggle with this condition. All right, number 6 is a little tricky. So I would say, generally speaking, B is going to be the preferred answer, primarily because A is just too broad. Okay, so the reference to many Republicans throughout American history is a lot of people over a long period of time. Okay, so potentially this could be the premise in a book about Republicans and the environment, but we're not talking about books. We're talking about college papers that are going to be somewhere between 3 and 10 pages in most cases. So we're not going to be able to really discuss all of these people over this long period of time in a clear, detailed, meaningful way. So I could see that statement in the introductory paragraph in the background information for that paper. Okay? So we can set up the information that yes, there have been many Republicans over the course of American history who've supported the environment, but then ultimately, in order to present a meaningful argument, we have to narrow it down to a smaller group of people and potentially just one person. And I think in this case, to narrow it down to this specific president, who was a very well-known Republican president, makes it a much stronger and a much more meaningful argument. All right, a lot of times students ask me where the thesis statement should be. And I would say there is definitely not one right or wrong answer. I have colleagues at the university who say that they don't make their students write a thesis statement if the argument is implied in the information in the introductory paragraph. The way I teach it to my freshman students at Towson University is the way we're looking at it here. So in teaching them the structure of a college paper, we begin with the introductory paragraph. Okay? I would always, especially for someone who is still kind of shaky on how to write a college paper, to play it safe, start with a topic sentence. The topic sentence should introduce the general idea of the paper, and that can be somewhat broad, but we need to narrow down the focus of the paper pretty quickly. Okay, so we then need to introduce very quickly relevant facts. That could be statistics, quotes from experts, historical facts, whatever it is that you're writing about, to create the context of your argument. Okay, and also exigency or exigence to show how important and how urgent that is. Okay, so the one thing I always try to steer students away from is to make the introductory paragraph a sort of very vague, broad, kind of meandering, rambling thing. Give your reader relevant facts that show the context and the importance of what we're writing about to engage them very quickly. Okay, and those facts should very quickly set up the actual argument, which will then be expressed in the thesis statement. Sometimes students want to know if they can begin with a thesis statement and then fill in the background information. That's also a possibility. Again, I will not tell you that there's just one possible solution to that, but if you are new to writing college papers, if you're unsure how to structure them, this is the approach I would go with. Topic sentence, background information, thesis statement, okay? And then begin in the body of your paper to present the data and the analysis of those data to back it up. The other thing is that generally, and most of you have been taught to do this in high school, is to restate your thesis in the concluding paragraph or the concluding section. Okay? So the one thing you don't want to do, and I've seen students do that, is to literally copy and paste the thesis statement from the introductory paragraph into the concluding paragraph. Okay. The thesis statement essentially says, this is what I'm going to prove to you. That statement doesn't make sense at the very end because hopefully by the concluding paragraph, you will have proven this in the body of your paper. Okay. So to say, I am going to prove this to you at this point doesn't really make any sense. Okay. So what you want to do is restate it in the context of the facts that you have presented in the body of your paper. Now, one area of issues I see sometimes is that students now start summarizing some of the facts from the body of the paper into their concluding paragraph. So what we're now seeing is after reading a paper with very specific detailed facts, we're now getting the sort of general summary of things we have just read. Please don't do that. Okay. If you're writing in your future careers a very long document, whether it's a report that's 50 to 100 pages long, then yes, your concluding section will be a summary of some of the highlights of that document, which most likely nobody will read cover to cover. So it makes sense there to provide that summary. But if it's a 3 to 5 page paper or even a 10-page paper, we've just read those facts. We don't need to read them again. Okay, it becomes unnecessary and repetitive, and it's the deadliest way to end up a paper. Okay. So if you just want to restate the thesis statement in the context of what you've said, do it quickly, do it very concisely. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. The other thing I teach my students in my freshman writing classes, if your paper addresses a problem, one way to restate that general argument is to briefly discuss a potential solution you found in your research. Because by saying, here's a potential solution, you are reiterating the fact that there's a problem, because if there weren't a problem, there wouldn't be a potential potential solution. It's also a more interesting way of looking at, okay, we've established there's a problem. Where do we go from here? How do we get there? Okay? If your paper discusses a solution, and frequently that's done through data, through studies, clinical studies, whatever it is, one way to sort of personalize that would be to briefly address or cite a specific personal example from your research. So if you're writing a paper about how certain kind of meditation can help veterans with PTSD, in the body of that paper you would have clinical studies or case studies. In your concluding paragraph, you may briefly discuss the story of one particular soldier who has returned from Iraq or Afghanistan, who has engaged in this kind of meditation and found it to be helpful. And so that's just, again, a more interesting way of wrapping it up rather than restating in general terms everything you've already said in specific terms. Okay. All right, on the final slide, there are some resources. So you want to copy and paste those links into a web browser. There are basically websites with information, with exercises that can help you learn a little bit more about how to approach writing thesis statements. Thank you.